Winter, 1888. Harlan County, Kentucky, deep Appalachian territory. The snow fell silent on the ridges of Harlan County that December, thick and relentless, blanketing the mountains in a suffocating white. The kind of snow that erased roads, that turned landmarks into ghosts, that made the world outside your cabin door feel like another country entirely. In the valleys below, where the hollers grew narrow and dark, smoke rose from scattered chimneys, thin gray threads against an iron sky. This was coal country, mining country, the kind of place where men descended into the earth each morning uncertain if they'd see daylight again, where widows outnumbered wives, where the company store owned your soul before you'd finished paying for your father's coffin. But even in this harsh, unforgiving landscape, there were places that felt darker still, places where the shadows seemed to have weight, where the wind carried sounds that made even the hardest men cross themselves and whisper old prayers their grandmothers taught them. One such place stood at the end of Crow Hollow Road, the Church of the Blessed Redeemer. Crow Hollow was barely a town, more a collection of 23 families clinging to the mountainside like moss on stone. No more than 80 souls, if you counted the children. Most of the men worked the Black Diamond mine 3 miles south, hauling coal from veins that ran deep beneath the Appalachian spine. The women kept gardens in summer, preserved what they could, and prayed through the winters that their husbands wouldn't come home cold and broken. The settlement had no sheriff, no doctor who stayed more than a season, no schoolhouse that lasted through the harsh mountain weather. What it had was the church. Built in 1871 by the founding families, names like Jessup, Caldwell, Harmon, and Pike, the Church of the Blessed Redeemer was constructed from lumber hauled up the mountain by mule and hand. It stood 2 stories tall, with a bell tower that could be heard for miles when the wind was right. The building itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its weathered wood gone the color of old bruises. But it was the only gathering place the hollow had, the only source of community, the only institution that gave structure to lives otherwise defined by brutal labor and early death. And for 17 years, it had been presided over by Reverend Ezekiel Boone. Ezekiel Boone was not a young man in 1888. He was 57 years old, tall and gaunt, with long fingers that seemed to have too many joints. His face was narrow, almost vulpine, with deep-set eyes that reflected lamplight in peculiar ways. He wore his hair to his shoulders, an affectation that some found biblical, others found unsettling, and he never smiled. Not once, in 17 years, had anyone in Crow Hollow seen Reverend Boone smile. He'd come to the settlement in 1871, arriving on foot during a thunderstorm, drenched and shivering, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a Bible so worn the spine had split. He'd asked for shelter at the Jessup farm, and old Abraham Jessup, being a God-fearing man despite his rough ways, had taken him in. When Reverend Boone learned the church had no minister, the previous one having fled after a single winter, unable to endure the isolation, he'd volunteered himself. He had credentials, papers signed by a seminary in Charleston, West Virginia. He spoke with authority about Scripture. He seemed learned, disciplined, devoted. The settlement accepted him. They had little choice. Men of God didn't venture this deep into the mountains by accident, and they certainly didn't stay. But Ezekiel Boone stayed. He preached sermons that lasted 3 hours. He spoke of sin and judgment, of flesh and corruption, of the narrowness of the path to salvation. His voice, when he raised it in the pulpit, seemed to make the church walls vibrate. Some said it was the power of the Holy Spirit. Others said it was something else. He kept to himself between services, living in a small room behind the church proper, a space no larger than a prison cell, furnished with a cot, a desk, and shelves lined with books in languages most of the congregation couldn't read: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and others that used stranger alphabets still. He never married, never courted, never seemed to need company beyond his books and his prayers, but he baked bread. Every Sunday without fail, Reverend Boone baked bread for the congregation. Large, dark loaves with a texture unlike anything the women of the Hollow made in their own homes. Dense, heavy, with a faint metallic aftertaste that some found unpleasant, but most grew accustomed to. He called it the bread of affliction, a term from Deuteronomy, he explained, referencing the unleavened bread the Israelites ate during their captivity in Egypt. A reminder, he said, that suffering purifies the soul. The congregation ate it during communion. They took portions home wrapped in cloth. Some of the miners carried pieces in their pockets when they descended into the darkness of the Black Diamond, believing it offered protection. And for 17 years, no one questioned where Reverend Boone sourced his flour. It was on December 3rd, 1888, that Thomas Whitfield arrived in Crow Hollow. He came by way of the Cumberland Gap, traveling north from Tennessee on a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. Thomas was 32 years old, a former journalist from Knoxville who'd taken a position with the newly established Bureau of Vital Statistics, a government initiative meant to document births, deaths, and public health conditions in remote Appalachian communities. He was a small man, slight of build, with wire-rimmed spectacles that constantly fogged in the cold. He wore a city coat inadequate for mountain winters and carried a leather case containing census forms, vaccination records, and a notebook already half filled with observations about the communities he'd visited. Thomas Whitfield was educated, curious, and catastrophically unprepared for what he would find in Crow Hollow. He arrived just before dusk, when the light had gone thin and gray, when smoke from the evening fires hung low in the valley. He'd been directed to the Jessup farm by a postal rider in the last town, told it was the largest homestead, and that Abraham Jessup served as the Hollow's informal headman. The farm sat at the base of the ridge, a collection of buildings clustered around a main house with a sagging roof. Chickens scattered as Thomas dismounted, and a pair of hounds emerged from beneath the porch, barking half-heartedly before losing interest. Abraham Jessup himself appeared in the doorway, a broad man in his 60s, with a beard gone white and hands the size of dinner plates. He studied Thomas with the practiced wariness of someone accustomed to strangers bringing trouble. "Help you?" His voice was rough as tree bark. Thomas removed his hat, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look. "Thomas Whitfield, sir. Bureau of Vital Statistics, out of Frankfurt. I'm conducting a health and population census of the region. I was hoping I might find lodging for a few days while I complete my survey." Abraham's eyes narrowed. "Government man." "In an official capacity, yes, sir. But I assure you I'm not here to cause trouble. Just paperwork and record-keeping." A long silence. Then Abraham spat tobacco juice into the snow. "I suppose you can bed down in the storage loft. You'll work for your keep, though. We don't feed idle hands." "Of course. Thank you, Mr. Jessup." As Thomas led his horse toward the barn, Abraham called after him. "You'll want to meet Reverend Boone tomorrow. He keeps the church records. Births, deaths, marriages. Everything you government types care about." Thomas nodded, grateful for the guidance. He didn't notice the way Abraham's expression darkened when he mentioned the Reverend. Didn't catch the slight hesitation before he spoke the name. Didn't see the way Abraham touched the small iron cross hanging at his throat. An unconscious gesture, almost protective. That evening, Thomas sat at the Jessup family table. Abraham, his wife Martha, and their 3 grown children, along with 2 grandchildren too young for the mines. The meal was simple: venison stew, cornbread, and coffee so strong it tasted of rust. The conversation was sparse. Mountain people weren't quick to warm to outsiders, Thomas knew. But there was something else here. A tension he couldn't quite name. Finally, trying to break the silence, he asked, "I noticed the church on my way in. Quite an impressive building for a settlement this size." Abraham grunted. Martha's hands stilled on her spoon. "The Church of the Blessed Redeemer," Thomas continued. "Your minister must be quite devoted to maintain such a structure." "Reverend Boone is devoted," Abraham said carefully. That's one way to put it. How long has he served here? 17 years. Since the church was built. Thomas made a mental note for his records. And the congregation is healthy? No unusual illnesses, epidemics? Depends on your definition of unusual, Abraham muttered. Martha shot her husband a warning look. Thomas sensed an opening. Is there something I should be aware of? Part of my mandate is to document health concerns, unusual mortality patterns. We're fine, Martha interrupted, her voice firm. We survive. That's what mountain folk do. But her oldest son, a lean man named Caleb, who worked the Black Diamond mine, spoke up. Tell him about the bread. The table went silent. Caleb, Abraham warned. He's going to hear about it anyway, Caleb said. Might as well come from us. Thomas looked between them, his journalist's instinct awakening. What about the bread? Another long silence. Then Martha, speaking slowly, as if choosing each word with care. Reverend Boone bakes communion bread every Sunday, has for 17 years. Never misses, never runs out of flour, even in the hardest winters when the rest of us are down to our last handfuls. He has a supplier, surely. That's the thing, Caleb said, leaning forward. No one delivers to him. No wagons come up Crow Hollow Road with flour sacks. The trading post in town keeps records. Reverend Boone hasn't purchased flour in over a decade. Thomas frowned. Perhaps he has stores, a root cellar? Big enough to hold 10 years of flour? Caleb shook his head. And the bread itself, it's not like regular bread. It's heavy, dark, has a taste to it. What kind of taste? Like ashes, Martha said quietly, like ashes mixed with something bitter. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. One of the children started to cry softly. There's stories, Caleb continued, his voice dropping, about the cemetery behind the church, about graves that look disturbed, about the smoke that comes from the church chimney on Saturday nights when the reverend is alone preparing for Sunday service. That's enough, Abraham said firmly, standing from the table. You'll scare the children with your fool talk. And you, Mr. Whitfield, he turned to Thomas, you'd do well to complete your census and move along. Some questions are better left unasked in places like this. Thomas wanted to press further, but something in Abraham's expression made him hold his tongue. The old man was afraid. They were all afraid. That night, lying in the cold loft with hay prickling through his blanket, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the bread, about flour that never ran out, about ashes, about graves that looked disturbed. The next morning, Thomas set out early, before the Jessup family had finished breakfast. He told Abraham he wanted to survey the settlement, to count structures and households for his census. This was true, but not complete. What he really wanted was to see the church. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything coated in white silence. His breath plumed in the freezing air as he walked up Crow Hollow Road, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. The church appeared gradually through the morning mist, first its dark steeple, then its walls, until finally the whole structure emerged like something surfacing from deep water. Up close, it was more imposing than he'd realized. The wood was weathered almost black, and icicles hung from the eaves like teeth. There were no decorations, no crosses, or religious iconography visible on the exterior. Just dark wood and narrow windows that reflected nothing. Thomas circled the building slowly, his census forms forgotten in his case. Behind the church, just as Caleb had mentioned, was the cemetery. 37 graves, by his quick count, some quite old, the wooden markers leaning and illegible, but others were recent, fresh. And several looked wrong. He couldn't say exactly what disturbed him. The mounds seemed properly shaped, the snow undisturbed. But there was something about certain graves, a sunken quality, as if the earth beneath had collapsed slightly. as if there was less beneath the soil than there should be. Thomas knelt beside one of the sunken graves. The marker read, Nathaniel Pike, born 1851, died November 1888. The Lord gives and takes away. November. Last month. The earth should still be relatively fresh, mounded high. Instead, it had a concave depression, subtle but unmistakable. He was reaching out to brush snow from the marker when a voice behind him made him jump. "Can I help you, Mr. Whitfield?" Thomas spun around. Reverend Ezekiel Boone stood 10 feet away, appearing from nowhere, silent as smoke. He wore a long black coat that nearly touched the ground, and his pale eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the younger man want to step back. "Reverend Boone, I presume. I'm Thomas Whitfield, with the Bureau of—" "I know who you are." The Reverend's voice was soft, almost gentle, but somehow that made it worse. "Abraham Jessup mentioned you'd arrived, a census taker, documenting our little community." "Yes, sir. I was just observing the church grounds." "It's a beautiful structure. Is it?" Boone tilted his head slightly, like a crow examining something dead. "I've always thought it rather plain, functional. But then, beauty is not the point of a church, is it? The point is devotion, sacrifice, sustenance." The way he said the last word made Thomas's skin prickle. "I notice you maintain a cemetery here," Thomas said, trying to sound professional. "For my records, I'll need to document burials and—" "All the records you need are inside," Boone interrupted, gesturing toward the church. "Come, I'll show you." It wasn't a request. Thomas followed the Reverend toward the church door, glancing back once at the sunken grave of Nathaniel Pike. In the morning light, he could see what he'd missed before. A faint trail in the snow, leading from the grave to the back door of the church, as if something had been dragged from one to the other. As if someone had made the walk many times, wearing a path. Reverend Boone opened the church door, and a smell wafted out, yeast and smoke and something underneath, something Thomas couldn't identify, but that reminded him inexplicably of the rendering plant outside Knoxville, where they boiled down animal carcasses for tallow and glue. "After you, Mr. Whitfield," the Reverend said, his face unreadable in the shadows of the doorway. "I imagine you'll find our records quite complete." And as Thomas stepped across the threshold into the darkness of the Church of the Blessed Redeemer, the door swung shut behind him with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The interior of the Church of the Blessed Redeemer was colder than the winter outside. Thomas felt it immediately, a dampness that seemed to seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the quality of the air itself. It tasted stale, recycled, like breath exhaled and inhaled too many times in an enclosed space. The main sanctuary was sparse. Wooden pews arranged in rigid rows, a pulpit carved from dark oak, and windows so narrow they admitted almost no light. What illumination existed came from oil lamps hung at intervals along the walls, their flames guttering and smoking, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "This way," Reverend Boone said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He moved toward a door behind the pulpit, his long coat trailing across the floorboards without making a sound. Thomas followed, his census case clutched against his chest like a shield. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to walk back out into the clean snow and frozen air, to forget whatever questions had brought him here. But his curiosity, that journalistic compulsion that had driven him into this profession, kept his feet moving forward. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "The church records are kept below," Boone explained, producing a key from somewhere within his coat. "The basement stays dry year-round, protects the documents from moisture and mold." He lit a lantern hanging beside the doorway and began descending. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas followed. The stairs were steep, the treads worn smooth by years of use. Thomas counted 23 steps before they reached the bottom, emerging into a low-ceilinged space that extended beneath the entire church. Support posts rose at intervals, and the walls were lined with shelves. But it wasn't the records that drew Thomas's attention. It was the smell. Stronger now, unmistakable. Not just yeast and smoke, but something organic and wrong. Like a butcher's shop in summer. Like the rendering plant, but sweeter, more acrid. Thomas pressed his handkerchief to his nose. "What is that odor?" "Purification," Boone answered simply, moving deeper into the basement. The lantern light revealed more details. A large stone furnace built into the far wall, its iron door hanging open to reveal ashes within. Beside it, a heavy wooden table scarred with cuts and stains. And everywhere, on every available surface, ceramic jars, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Each one labeled with a name and date. Thomas stepped closer to the nearest shelf, his hands trembling as he lifted his spectacles to read the labels in the dim light. Nathaniel Pike, November 1888. Sarah Caldwell, September 1888. James Harmon, July 1888. Elizabeth Jessup, March 1888. He recognized some of the names from the cemetery above. Recent burials, recent deaths. "What?" Thomas's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What is in these jars, Reverend?" Boone stood beside the furnace, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the lantern's flame. When he spoke, his voice held no emotion whatsoever. No guilt, no shame, just the flat tone of someone explaining a simple process. "Remains," he said. "After the flesh returns to earth, what remains must be preserved, purified, transformed into something useful, something sacred." Thomas's mind reeled. "You're telling me these jars contain human ashes?" "Calcified bone matter, ground to powder. Yes." Boone moved to the table, where several large bowls sat beside burlap sacks. "Mixed with wheat flour in proper proportions, it creates the bread of affliction. The congregation has been consuming it every Sunday for 17 years. The census case slipped from Thomas's numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. His stomach heaved. He thought of the Jessup family table, of Martha cutting thick slices of dark bread for her grandchildren, of miners carrying pieces in their pockets for protection. "You've been feeding them. You've been feeding them their own dead?" "Their own ancestors," Boone corrected, as if this distinction mattered. "Their mothers and fathers, their children who died in infancy, their brothers crushed in mine collapses. I return them to the community. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is lost." Thomas backed toward the stairs, but Boone made no move to stop him. Instead, the Reverend continued speaking, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a sermon. "Do you know what it's like here, Mr. Whitfield? In these mountains, people die constantly. Mining accidents, childbirth, disease, starvation. Every winter, at least 5 families face the choice between buying food or buying coffins. They can barely afford to bury their dead, much less feed their living." He gestured to the jars with something approaching tenderness. "I solve both problems. The deceased are cremated, a practice as old as human civilization, though these mountain folk knew nothing of it before I came. The ashes are sanctified, ground and mixed with flour. The bread feeds the congregation, sustains them, gives them strength." "It's desecration," Thomas whispered. "It's unholy. It's practical," Boone interrupted, his pale eyes catching the lamplight. "And it's biblical. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." John, chapter 6. The earliest Christians understood. Transubstantiation, communion, the body and blood made literal. That's not what that means, isn't it? Boone smiled for the first time, and Thomas wished he hadn't. The expression looked wrong on that angular face, like a mask slipping. "Tell me, Mr. Whitfield, in your travels through these mountains, have you noticed something unusual about Crow Hollow?" Thomas said nothing, but his mind was racing, now that Boone mentioned it. No epidemics, Boone continued. In 17 years, not a single outbreak of typhoid, cholera, or consumption. No widespread illness. The miners here suffer fewer accidents than those in neighboring counties. Women survive childbirth at rates that would astonish your medical colleagues in Frankfurt. Children grow strong despite the harsh conditions. He moved closer, and Thomas pressed back against the cold stone wall. The bread protects them, Mr. Whitfield. The communion of their ancestors gives them strength, immunity, resilience. They don't know why they're healthier than other settlements. They attribute it to God's favor, to my prayers. But it's simpler than that. It's chemistry. It's biology. Bone ash contains calcium, phosphorus, minerals the body needs. Combined with wheat, consumed regularly, it fortifies them. They don't know, Thomas said, the realization hitting him. They don't know what you're doing. Of course not. If they knew, they'd reject it. Their superstitions would override their survival instincts. So I keep the secret. I tend the dead. I bake the bread. I keep this community alive. Thomas's journalist's mind, even in shock, was making connections. The graves. The sunken graves. You've been digging them up. After a year, yes. Once the flesh has decomposed sufficiently. I retrieve the bones, bring them here, and commit them to the furnace. Then I return the earth to its proper place. No one notices. No one questions. Boone gestured to a ledger on the table, a record book with meticulous entries. I've documented everything. Dates, weights, ratios, it's all here. Thomas stared at the ledger, at the neat columns of handwriting detailing 17 years of systematic exhumation and cremation. His hands shook as he reached for it, opened it, saw the calculations, pounds of bone ash to pounds of flour, yield per body, distribution schedules. At the top of the first page, in elaborate script, "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Nothing shall be wasted." "You're insane," Thomas breathed. "I'm practical," Boone repeated, "and I'm effective. Look at the records yourself, Mr. Whitfield. Census the population. You'll find Crow Hollow thrives where other settlements wither. My methods are unorthodox, yes, but they work." Thomas felt bile rising in his throat. He stumbled toward the stairs, desperate for fresh air, for escape, for anything to be away from this basement with its jars of human ash and its madman keeper. But Boone's voice followed him up the steps. "What will you do now, Mr. Whitfield? Report me? Expose me? Tell the congregation what they've been eating?" Thomas stopped at the top of the stairs, one hand on the doorframe. "If you tell them," Boone continued from below, "they'll reject the bread. Within 2 years, disease will return. Mining accidents will increase. Children will die. The settlement will collapse. Is that what you want? To destroy the very people you came here to help?" Thomas pushed through the door into the main sanctuary, gasping. The cold air felt clean after the fetid atmosphere of the basement. His mind spun with impossible choices. If he exposed Boone, he'd destroy the community's health. If he stayed silent, he'd be complicit in this grotesque violation. He burst through the church's front doors and out into the snow, falling to his knees and vomiting until his stomach was empty. When he looked up, he saw figures approaching through the falling snow. Abraham Jessup, his son Caleb, 3 other men from the settlement, all carrying tools, axes, pickaxes, shovels. Abraham's face was grim. "You know, don't you? You went into the basement." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. "How long have you known?" he managed finally. Abraham's jaw worked. 3 years. I caught him one night, digging up my wife's grave. Elizabeth. His voice broke on her name. He told me everything, showed me the records, explained what he'd been doing. "And you let him continue?" "What choice did I have?" Abraham's eyes were haunted. He was right. We're healthier than we've ever been. My grandchildren are strong. The mines are safer. And Elizabeth? He swallowed hard. She's still feeding her family. still keeping us alive. Is that not a blessing?" Thomas stared at them, horrified. "You're going to let him keep doing this?" "No," Caleb said quietly, raising his pickaxe. "We're going to stop him, tonight, but not for the reasons you think." Abraham nodded. "Reverend Boone served his purpose. He kept us alive through hard times. But his methods, they've corrupted something in this place. We feel it, the wrongness. It's time to end it." "But if you stop him," Thomas began. "We'll take our chances with God and nature," Abraham interrupted. "We're mountain people. We survived before Boone came. We'll survive after." He looked at the other men. "We do this quick, clean. Then we burn everything in that basement. The jars, the records, all of it." They moved toward the church entrance, and Thomas, despite everything, found himself following. Whatever was about to happen, he needed to witness it, to document it. Inside, Reverend Boone stood before the pulpit, as if he'd been waiting. He showed no fear as the men surrounded him. "I saved you," he said simply. "All of you, your families, your children." "You defiled our dead," Abraham replied. "That's not salvation. That's damnation. Then you choose death over life? We choose to live with our souls intact." What happened next occurred with brutal efficiency. The men seized Boone, binding his arms with rope. He didn't struggle, didn't cry out. Just watched them with those pale, unblinking eyes. They carried him down into the basement, and Thomas, God help him, followed with the lantern. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. Abraham looked at the stone furnace, its iron door still hanging open. "We're going to finish what he started, one last cremation, one last addition to his bread." Boone's expression never changed, even as they forced him toward the furnace. "You'll regret this," he said calmly. "Without the bread, the weakness will return, the sickness, the death. You'll watch your children waste away, and remember this moment." "Maybe," Abraham said, "but at least we'll die human." They locked Boone inside the furnace and lit the fire. The screaming lasted 7 minutes. The dawn broke gray and cheerless over Crow Hollow, illuminating a scene that would haunt Thomas Whitfield for the remainder of his days. The Church of the Blessed Redeemer still stood, but smoke rose from every window, thick, black, choking smoke that could be seen for miles. The men had spent the entire night burning everything: the jars of bone ash, the records, the ledgers, the furniture, the tools, and Boone's body, what remained of it after the furnace had done its work. Thomas sat on the steps of the Jessup farmhouse, his census forms abandoned, his official purpose forgotten. He documented everything in his personal notebook, page after page of shaking handwriting detailing the most disturbing story he'd ever encountered. But who would believe it? And if they did believe it, what good would come from the telling? Abraham emerged from the farmhouse, looking 20 years older than he had 2 days ago. His hands were black with soot, and his eyes were red from smoke and tears. "It's done," he said, sitting heavily beside Thomas. "Everything's burned. We'll tear down the church itself come spring. Build something new, something clean." "What will you tell the others?" Thomas asked. "The rest of the congregation?" "The truth. Some of it, anyway. That Reverend Boone was desecrating graves. That we discovered it and dealt with him. We won't mention the bread, no reason to. They'll stop taking communion, stop eating what he baked. Within a few months, the last of it will be gone from their systems. And then?" Abraham stared at the smoking ruin of the church. "Then we see what happens. Maybe Boone was lying. Maybe we were never healthier because of his bread. Maybe it was just chance, or God's will, or clean mountain air." He paused. "And maybe he was telling the truth, and we just condemned ourselves to suffering and death." "You did the right thing," Thomas said, though the words felt hollow. "Did I?" Abraham turned to look at him. "Tell me, Mr. Whitfield, When does practicality become evil? When does survival justify desecration? If the bread truly kept us healthy, kept our children alive, was Boone a monster or a savior? Thomas had no answer. Over the next 3 days, as he completed his census of Crow Hollow, Thomas watched the community grapple with the revelation. Abraham had gathered the congregation and told them an edited version of events, that Reverend Boone had been exhuming bodies for unclear purposes, that his practices were unholy, that he'd been dealt with and the church purified. Some wept, some raged. A few wanted to dig up the furnace ruins and desecrate Boone's ashes in return, but mostly, they were afraid. Martha Jessup cornered Thomas on his 4th day in the settlement. "You're a learned man," she said urgently. "You've seen cities, hospitals. Tell me true. Can consuming bone matter really make people healthier?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. In his research for the Census Bureau, he'd read medical journals, studies on nutrition and public health. He knew that bone contained minerals, that calcium and phosphorus were essential, that malnourished populations often suffered from deficiencies. Could Boone's grotesque bread have actually worked? "I don't know," he admitted finally. "The science isn't clear. But even if it did help Mrs. Jessup, some prices are too high to pay. Some methods are too wrong to justify, no matter the outcome." She nodded slowly, but her eyes held doubt. "My daughter died 2 years ago. Fever. She was 7 years old." Her voice cracked. "If Reverend Boone put her ashes in the bread, if I've been eating pieces of my own child, is that blasphemy or mercy?" Thomas had no answer for that either. He left Crow Hollow on the morning of December 10th, 1888, with his census incomplete and his faith in humanity deeply shaken. He documented 81 souls in the settlement, though that number didn't include Reverend Ezekiel Boone, whose existence Thomas decided to omit from his official report entirely. As his horse picked its way down the mountain trail, Thomas looked back one final time. The church was a blackened skeleton against the snow, and already the settlement looked diminished without it, smaller, more vulnerable. He wondered how many of them would survive the winter. Epilogue, May 1890. Thomas Whitfield never published his account of Crow Hollow. The notebook sat in a locked drawer in his Frankfurt office for 18 months, unread, as he tried to lose himself in the routine work of census-taking and vital statistics. But in May of 1890, a report crossed his desk that made his blood run cold. It was from a field agent surveying eastern Kentucky counties. Buried in the middle of a routine population document was a note about Crow Hollow. Settlement shows significant population decline. Current population, 41, down from Esther's 80 in 1888. Multiple deaths attributed to typhoid fever, 7. Mining accidents, 5. Complications in childbirth, 4. Consumption, 6. And other causes. Local residents report unusual increase in illness and mortality. Recommend further investigation. Thomas's hands shook as he read the numbers. In 18 months, nearly half the population dead or fled, the exact trajectory Boone had predicted. He wanted to believe it was coincidence, that the diseases and accidents were random, natural, unrelated to the absence of the Reverend's bread. But he knew better. That night, Thomas retrieved his notebook from the drawer and read through his account again. Then, carefully, methodically, he built a fire in his office fireplace and fed the pages into the flames, one by one. Some truths, he realized, were too dangerous to preserve, too disturbing to share. If Boone had been right, if his methods had genuinely kept the community healthy, then exposing him had killed more people than it saved. Thomas would carry that guilt until his own death in 1923. But if Boone had been lying, if the bread had been nothing but a madman's delusion and the subsequent deaths mere coincidence, then burning the evidence protected a community's dignity. Let them believe they'd stopped a monster, not martyred a miracle worker. Either way, the truth was too heavy to bear. The last page of the notebook curled and blackened in the fire. On it, Thomas had written a single line from Deuteronomy, the verse that had given the bread its name. "Thou shalt eat the bread of affliction all the days of thy life." As the words disappeared into ash, Thomas whispered a prayer for the people of Crow Hollow, both the dead who'd been desecrated and the living who'd consumed them, and for Reverend Ezekiel Boone, who'd blurred the line between salvation and damnation so completely that even God might struggle to judge him. Historical note. In 1891, the settlement of Crow Hollow was officially abandoned. The last families relocated to larger towns in the valley, citing economic hardship and persistent illness. The ruined church stood for another decade before collapsing in a winter storm. Today, nothing remains of the settlement except foundations overgrown with mountain laurel and a cemetery with 37 graves, all undisturbed now, their occupants resting in whatever peace the dead can know. Local historians occasionally mention Crow Hollow in surveys of abandoned Appalachian settlements, but no one remembers why it failed. No one recalls the Church of the Blessed Redeemer or Reverend Ezekiel Boone. The story died with Thomas Whitfield, consumed by fire and silence. Some secrets, perhaps, should stay buried. But on certain winter nights, hikers in that remote corner of Harlan County report smelling smoke where no fires burn and catching the faint, nauseating scent of something baking, something that smells of yeast and ashes and desperation. The locals avoid those mountains now. They know better than to eat bread offered by strangers. And they never, ever ask what happened to the old church at the end of Crow Hollow Road. The end.